right. Well, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. Today I'm joined by Dr. Nick Tiller, who is a senior researcher in applied physiology at Harbor UCLA, a columnist at Skeptical Inquirer magazine, and an author of the award-winning book, The Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science, Confronting Myths of the Health and Fitness Industry. Just starting off, though, did I pronounce your last name correctly? Is it Tiller?
It is.
Okay. Correct. All right. I successful in that one. So, all right. So when did you first get interested in health and fitness?
Well, I come from a sport and exercise science background. So in the US, it's kinesiology. The curricula is pretty much identical.
Yeah.
And I finished my undergraduate degree in 2005. I stayed at the same university, a place called the University of Hertfordshire, which is just outside North London in the United Kingdom. And I did my master's in exercise physiology. And I knew very early on that I wanted to specialize in physiology. I was just fascinated with how the body responded to different stimuli, whether it was exercise or aviation, space travel, thermal stress, heat and cold, extremes of temperature. And so I knew very early on that I wanted to be a physiologist. And at the time I was pretty much obsessed with working in sport. I wanted to work with elite athletes, pretty much everyone who's studying sports science at that kind of level pretty much has the same ambitions. So, and I was one of the very fortunate few to actually accomplish that dream. And I worked for a couple of years at a place called the English Institute of Sport in the United Kingdom, which is the service provider of choice to the Olympic performance programs. And after a couple of years of being there, I sort of realized that I'd fallen in love with the science more than I had the performance sport. So I went and did my PhD in human applied physiology, specifically respiratory. So I guess through the years, I've just kind of developed and cultured and nurtured this passion that I have for exercise science and have moved more into the realm of exercise physiology.
Yeah, okay, that's cool. And I think I read that you also have like a little bit of a sports background as well, didn't you? You were involved with a few things, right? I think were an athlete doing like marathons, or I think I've even read you were doing some like MMA stuff as well, or?
Yeah, so I started doing karate when I was really young, about 8 years old, and I got my black belt in karate. I was crazy about martial arts until the age of about 18, 19, and then I steadily transitioned. It's not a clear transition from martial arts into distance running. In terms of performance sport, they're pretty much as opposite ends of the spectrum. One's kind of very explosive and one's endurance based. Did my first marathon when I was 18 years old, and just really to prove that I could do it. And then I got the bug for it, and I wanted to test myself running longer and longer distances. And since then I've done about somewhere between 40 and 50 marathons and ultra marathons. And I've done a couple of 100-mile trail races. I did the Marathon des Sables in 2011, which is a 7-day race through the Sahara Desert. So I've kind of had the opportunity to approach my interest in performance sport, not just from a scientific perspective, but from a practical perspective as well. And it's enjoyable being able to kind of link those two worlds together.
Yeah, I think that's also a kind of a key thing with the work that you do, because having the background, as an athlete as well, can help you understand, where a lot of people are coming from when it comes to, kind of understanding the fitness world and what's right for your body and what's not. Rather than just being able to tell people the science about it, you can kind of relate to them on that sort of personal level too, like, hey, I used to do this, and this is how things work or whatever. But gives you,
it helps me to empathize with athletes if I'm working with them, or if we're doing research and the athlete is putting themselves through this kind of really arduous exercise protocol, then I can empathize with them. I know what they're going through. And especially, in the context of what we're talking about today, pseudoscience in medicine and health and sport. When I see athletes and they're so desperate to get a leg up on the competition, to enhance their performance, and they're reaching out to all of these different products and practices and interventions and diets and supplements, I can empathize with them, because I've been in that place, taking the supplements and trying the diets and trying everything under the sun to augment my performance. So I know what they're going through. I've just been able to sort of refine my critical thinking capacities a little bit more over the years since I got interested in scientific skepticism, and it gives me a different perspective.
Yeah, and I can imagine, when you're with your connections to UCLA, that you would see probably a lot of that with sort of college age student athletes, or just anyone who's in college. I remember when I was in college seeing lots of people taking various supplements, when before they go to gym or after the gym, and it does seem like a lot of younger people are especially interested in the supplement industry for sure. So,
And especially in the US, because if you're from the US and you're listening, you may not have an appreciation for how the British or the European system works. But when I first came over here, I was blown away at the magnitude of the interest in sport,
yeah,
because it's normal here, even for a small scale university, to have a 10, 20, 30, 40,000 seater stadium for their college football
yeah,
team, you
yep,
know.
yep,
And in the UK, it's like professional clubs might have stadiums that size, but sport just really isn't as big. We don't have the same kind of interest, don't have the same money that's going into it.
right.
So I suppose we do have the interest, but we don't have the resources, we don't have the money, and we don't have the numbers of people competing. So really over here, it's just it's above and beyond what you normally see in Europe.
Yeah, it does seem like I hear a lot from immigrants, especially, that American sports culture is kind of off the charts when it comes when it comes to their understanding of sports in their own countries. Like, it's kind of ridiculous, almost, how much people are really consumed by sports in the U.S. I even know, like, my first high school I went to, they had like a football program that wasn't especially very good, American football program, and they built a multi-million-dollar football stadium for a team that was not all that successful, and they hired a big coach to come in, and like, it seemed like a good portion of the teachers at the high school were football coaches, and you see like how some communities can be completely oriented based around their sports programs, and that's like the identity for them. So it's just kind of one of those interesting aspects of American society, where kind of sport is one of the centers of community. It's really weird. So,
But with the interest in it, it comes also at the same time greater opportunity to exploit that interest,
yep,
and to
yep,
misappropriate the scientific evidence and
yeah,
make unreasonable claims, which is, I guess, what we're talking about today.
yeah. I mean, there's so many different things that can be impacted by that, and also when you're shuffling money around from academic programs to sports programs, that causes
Mm.
other issues as well. So let's see. Now, when did you first become sort of concerned about pseudoscience in the health and fitness world?
Yeah, so it was about the time that I finished my master's, which was 2007. I did a master's in exercise physiology at the University of Hertfordshire, and I was looking, it was kind of innocuous actually, because I was looking for science-based content on iTunes, just looking for
Yeah.
podcasts because I wanted something to listen to on my commute. And I just stumbled across a podcast called The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe.
Okay. Yeah.
And superficially, I mean, very famous podcast, very popular. And superficially, it's just a science-based podcast, and they talk about news stories and new discoveries in science. But actually, that was my kind of gateway, my window, if you like, to a whole world of
Yeah.
scientific skepticism and critical thinking. That's how I got introduced to what I later found out was an entire movement of scientific skepticism. And the further down the rabbit hole I went, the more passionate, more enthusiastic I became about the subject. And it dawned on me that all of the principles of critical thinking and scientific skepticism, so things like humility, evidence-based practice, things like academic and scientific integrity, ethics, prioritizing the process above any and all conclusions that might result.
Right.
These principles are in stark contrast to what we see in the commercial health and fitness industry,
Yes.
where science really is subordinate to marketing. Marketing is everything.
Yeah.
And manufacturers will say whatever they want, they'll do whatever they want, they'll make whatever claims they like. They're not held accountable to having to provide any evidence for those claims. So that's when I really saw the stark incongruence between those two worlds. And I've spent the last, more than a decade trying to bridge those two worlds together.
Yeah.
So trying to bring the world of scientific skepticism closer to the world of health and fitness and the commercial health and fitness industry. And essentially that's kind of that decade-long journey culminated in the publishing of my book, Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science, which is essentially the outcome of that journey of trying to bridge those two worlds.
Yeah. Okay. And so you mentioned earlier that, I guess, prior to sort of stumbling upon the skeptic community and podcasting world, you were using different supplements and stuff when you're doing different athletic events and such things. So did you have like kind of one of those moments where you're just wondering, like, what am I putting in my body, and is this actually helping me at all? Or
Yeah, so I suppose by the time that I got really interested in sport and really enthusiastic, I already had a reasonably good foundation in science. So I'd already had my undergraduate degree and my master's. So I understood the importance of evidence-based practice. So when I was taking supplements, I always made sure that they were evidence-based to a certain extent.
Sure.
But I suppose going back further, before I started becoming interested in sports science as a profession, I can think of lots of scenarios where my critical faculties were really found wanting, and I'm sort of embarrassed and ashamed at the stuff that I used to believe in. I can give you one example. Anybody who's listening who's interested in martial arts will understand the concept of chi energy.
Okay.
And chi energy is kind of this internal life force that you're supposed to be able to harness, and it goes in line with your breathing and your energy and these kinds of things. And this notion of chi is kind of wrapped up in Eastern philosophy and meditation, and almost kind of has religious connotations to it as well. And it's also one of the concepts of ancient Chinese medicine, things like acupuncture and Reiki, these kinds of what we'd now consider to be pseudosciences. They're not evidence-based. And I really used to think that chi and the energy flow was a real thing. Now, as a scientist, we know that energy has a very specific definition relating to the amount of work or joules that you can perform in a given period of time. But when I was younger, I really thought that I could harness this kind of internal life energy, and I loved the idea of that. I loved that there was this sort of supernatural, wonderfully imaginative and creative world beyond what we could see and measure. And I think, and so again, it helps me to empathize. I understand why people like to believe in these things, because they like to think that there's an existence more exciting than our superficially mundane existence.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing for a lot of people is, it's kind of boring if everything is, just kind of, you're scratching off all the different sort of supernatural instincts that people might have to drift towards these ideas and concepts that can, I suppose, give them a little bit more fulfillment in life, or give them the perception of fulfillment. And I think one of the big things, I guess, then for people like you that are communicating these science-based practices to people in the world is, I guess, I feel like for people, science can be that thing that kind of gives you that almost spiritual, worldview a little bit, because it's fascinating, all these things and how our bodies work and the different things you can put in your bodies and what they can do to help you. I mean, I've always kind of felt like it's a little misplaced to feel like, science is pushing too hard against that instinct to have some big world view of your place in the universe, because just the fact that you're here and we're able to understand these things. I mean, a lot of the scientific concepts that we've learned over thousands of years, in their own way, are kind of these miracles, because it's just an incredible knowledge that we've been able to obtain over time by studying our universe. And
science is awe-inspiring.
Yeah.
And the more you learn, the more you'll be inspired. And I think there's a Richard Feynman quote here, an ode to a flower, that I think is absolutely appropriate. And he describes this conversation he had with an artist friend of his, and he says that that, his artist friend was upset with him because as an artist, he can look at this flower and he can look at it and he can identify it and he can appreciate the aesthetic beauty of the thing. But you as a scientist, you have to, strip it all away and quantify it and measure it, and it becomes this boring, dull thing. And Feynman says, well, that's an opinion that I don't agree with very much.
Right.
First of all, I as a scientist can appreciate this thing on an aesthetic level, just like I might not be as refined as the artist, but I can still appreciate it. But as a scientist, I can also look at the internal processes. I can look at the cells. I can understand the colors. It adds an interesting question, the idea that the colors have evolved to attract insects. It adds another question. Does this aesthetic beauty exist at smaller dimensions? And so actually, as a scientist, I think understanding how the world operates and how things work, understanding the mechanics of reality, I don't see how it takes away. I think it only adds to the beauty of existence. And so I think part of our jobs as science communicators is to get people to understand that and open people's eyes to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the complexity of science doesn't have to be scary. The fact that it's complex just means that it's, I think, just kind of there's more of kind of a special aspect to it, because you have to kind of work to understand the concepts in depth. But even then, if you just want to understand the big picture of a concept, you could still do that as well without, being a scientist yourself or spending hours studying the subject. You can still kind of get the gist of how things work and understand why, hey, that's actually pretty cool. And it doesn't have to be something like, oh, I'm less special as a person because I don't have some life force or something else. Just the fact that you exist and all the complexities that make up you as a human being I think are pretty cool, and just as cool as anything else that you could come up with. So
yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, I think reality is far more incredible than anything we can dream up. So
yeah, it's right. Yeah, there's plenty about reality that's pretty fascinating. So I think people should give it another shot if they're drifting away from it. So let's see. Now, obviously, there's so many different, pseudo medical practices in the world of health and fitness. We could talk about a billion of them, really. But what would you say are the sort of the biggest issues today in terms of pseudoscience in the health and fitness world that you're seeing?
And do you mean specific products and practices?
Yeah, you could say specific products or practices or something that you see as this is probably the most dangerous thing that we're seeing today. This is going to cause the most harm in the long run.
Yeah, without doubt, social media.
Okay.
It's society has changed dramatically in the last 50 years since the advent of the internet, and with that, social media came along, and certainly what was intended when social media was conceived is not the system that we're dealing with now. It's kind of evolved embryonically and morphed into this monster that's been created, over which we have very little control. It very much controls us and our behaviors. And the way that social media is now being used to target and manipulate people's thoughts and opinions, and create division. We see it now in the American political system. I think that division is very much due to the way that social media has manipulated our decisions. And when I see the way that this has been sort of co-opted by people in health and fitness, and you see the quote unquote influencers who are disseminating information on social media, on Instagram and Twitter primarily, but Facebook as well. And there are studies on this. Generally, the people that have the most followers on social media in general tend to have the least education on a particular subject. And so as a result, they end up disseminating bad advice, misinformation, disinformation as well. And this is how bad ideas get spread, and so-called fake news spreads much further and farther and broader on social media than objective facts.
Yeah.
And so social media for me is probably the biggest concern, I think, for society as a whole, but particularly for health and fitness, given the number of people that set themselves up as health gurus, for example.
Yeah, I mean, and that you mentioned, people with most followers and stuff, those people, stemming from the entertainment industry or even athletes, people that are on television all the time and are able to develop a huge following because of that, because they're being shown to everyone. Um, and it's kind of a weird situation because uh, obviously a lot of these people are probably not aware of the information that they're promoting is completely false. Some of them may be, some of them may be profiting off it, but I assume that most people are doing it because they actually think that it works. And that's one of the things about social media that has really become dangerous, is that you got a lot of people that have become incredibly popular and can promote any thought that pops into their head to millions and millions of people, um, even if they're not really promoting something that's wrong on purpose. And how to strike that balance where you're going to get people that are becoming these major figures in pop culture to take a harder look at things. That's a real challenge.
Yeah, well, the research shows that the athletes so popular athletes who have large social
Yeah,
media followings are pioneering population trends in alternative therapies. So if their legions of followers see them using cupping, in the case of Michael Phelps, or acupuncture or chiropractic, they're more likely to try it because, a revered athlete has been seen to use it, and
right.
they're perceived to be authorities. Going back to something you said, I think sometimes this information is propagated by accident, and sometimes it is very deliberate.
Yeah,
So sometimes it's because an individual hasn't really done a deep dive on the literature, and they don't know that what they're using doesn't have a scientific underpinning. They're
right.
trying, again, to use the example of cupping. They've seen a famous athlete using it. They used it and felt better. So the whole "it worked for me" argument. Maybe they're looking at the wrong resources, and they're being misled. They're not doing a deep dive on the literature. Maybe they don't have the time or the skills to do a deep dive on the scientific literature, which most people, if they're not scientists, don't.
Right.
But sometimes this stuff is being spread maliciously in
Yep.
order to stoke fear and misunderstanding, because that's what generates content. That's what generates engagement. I mean, we've only got to look at what's been happening with COVID over the past couple of years. And I was speaking to somebody on a podcast just last week, and we were talking about respiratory related interventions and how respiratory based products that are aimed at improving lung function, for example, have become much more popular since the start of the pandemic. And there are some people that are selling their products as cures or preventions for COVID. And there's
Wow.
not a shred of scientific evidence showing that training your respiratory muscles can protect you from COVID. But they're happy to make those claims and exploit the fear and the misunderstanding about COVID and the whole pandemic in order to sell product. And it's really unscrupulous. There are sort of no lows to which people will not stoop in order to make some money. So we've got to bear in mind that there are two types of people there. That some people do it inadvertently, some people do it very deliberately.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I think, on the internet at this point in time, you can pretty much find anyone who's going to promote anything, and it's just kind of a free for all. It's yeah, pretty disturbing to see. But I suppose the most disturbing aspect of this is just that the general public, you know, I think that education systems in a way have not been preparing for this, and have kind of
Agreed.
failed a lot of people who are growing up in this world or have lived in this world and are struggling to understand what's going on, what's truth and what's not. And obviously people can take the initiative themselves and try to do that, but if people and figure out and follow the science, but some people are don't have time for that. Everyone's working, they have families. I understand that everyone's got their own lives, but you would think that there would be a greater interest in implementing in education systems, just more ability to analyze things critically and understand what sources are. I know they do that in school to a certain extent, but clearly in the age of the internet and social media, this is only going to get worse if people are not being trained to understand it. And I suppose one of the biggest hindrances of that is the politicalization of topics and subjects like COVID-19. When something becomes super political, it's really hard to sort of thread that needle and have a conversation in a classroom without someone sort of getting upset about it. And so I think it's probably gonna have to take a really delicate balance to bring up subjects without sort of coming off as being politically biased about it. That's gonna be really tough.
Well, you've touched on a really important point. It's this idea that the educational systems at the moment are failing us, and they're not developing graduates either from school or college or university who are equipped from a sort of critical thinking perspective to be able to safely navigate the world in which they live. We need to be having whole classes devoted to how to use digital media effectively and productively, because again, this has been widely studied, but the current generation of young people are getting more of their information, entertainment, and news from social media and digital media in general than ever before. More than they are from books and newspapers and magazines and things like this. Old form print media and long form text as well. And even US adults get more of their news from social media than anywhere else. And yet the educational systems of which we're all a product are not actually teaching us how to use social media in an effective way. And I think there's too much kind of relying on people's ingrained cognitive capacities. And when you look into, the fact that I'm a physiologist, and I would be the first person to admit that I'm not a clinical psychologist. When I have to delve into these subjects, I will, in a paper, for example, I will always co-author with somebody who knows that area better than I do. But throughout the course of my writings, I've learned enough to know that we evolved logic and reason for economy and for survival. And our genes haven't really changed much at all, in the last 10,000 years or so since we were hunter-gatherers. But society has changed dramatically in just the last 50 years. And our critical faculties that have evolved, for one thing, are not really up to scratch to deal with. We've sort of got analog critical capacities trying to navigate a digital world. And they're failing us. Our critical faculties are failing us, and the educational systems are not equipping us to deal with that effectively, which is why social media, for example, is causing so many problems.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because you just look at the whole aspect of conspiracy theories, and then you look at that aspect of human nature where people are really, their minds are trained to find patterns in things. So if you really want to believe in something, you're going to find any pattern you want. So you can believe in that conspiracy theory that you're already kind of leaning towards, or you had a friend mention to you and you really trust that person's advice. There's so many factors at play, and it's pretty sad, because you have a lot of people that have no bad intention at all, and they're falling into these sort of traps being laid out for them, whether by a celebrity that is aware or some person that is profiting off it by selling some products as part of their business model. But yes, definitely scary times, and it's going to take a lot of kind of reforms, I guess, to society to figure out what's the best path forward to deal with these things. It's going to be really challenging. Now, you mentioned Michael Phelps and cupping, and you also mentioned other aspects like chiropractic care, which is also kind of funny, because it's funny that you mentioned that. Both my grandfathers were doctors, and they were complaining about chiropractic care, years ago. Even when my parents were children, about sort of the myths being promoted in that industry. And it's funny. It's only grown more popular over time. But what would you say is the thing on the rise that many people are not aware of in the sort of health and fitness world?
Yeah, chiropractic, I'll just touch on that briefly, because chiropractic is a wonderful example of how something can become wildly popular despite the fact that the scientific evidence is really, really lacking. I mean,
Right.
the disparity between the claims and the evidence is as big for chiropractic as it is for anything. And somehow it's just kind of been smuggled into mainstream practice. And chiropractors have done a wonderful job, because the associations now, they have their own official associations. They have chiropractic universities. You can get
Yep.
degrees and
Yep.
PhDs in chiropractic, which all lend this kind of legitimacy or false legitimacy to the practice.
Yeah.
Actually, when you look at the scientific evidence, as I've said, the claims and the evidence are just so disparate, more for chiropractic than I think almost for anything. And yet it's still popular because it's pervasive. You see it being used everywhere. You know, somewhere between 50 to 60% of athletes have used chiropractic. 80 to 90% of physicians have prescribed alternative therapies, including chiropractic and acupuncture. And so the fact that it's so widely used, despite the fact that there's no scientific evidence, is really concerning. So I would say chiropractic deserves an honorable mention. In terms of practices that are on the rise, I don't think there's one that I could particularly single out. I think more and more supplements are being used by athletes all the time, because I think there is this perception that supplements absolutely work. Whereas the reality is a very tiny percentage of them really do. You know, some supplements really do work. You know, if using glucose drinks during a marathon, using creatine during explosive type events, caffeine as a stimulant, you know, all of these things have strong evidence underpinning their use, evidence for efficacy. But there are something like 30,000 different supplements available on the market around the world, and a tiny percentage of them actually work in the way that it is purported. So I think the rapid rise in the use of supplements in exercisers and people who are interested in health, and athletes as well, really is quite unprecedented at the moment. And as I say, unfortunately, only a very small percentage of them actually work in the way that it's purported.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I feel like new supplements are coming out all the time, and it seems like a never-ending stream, because you can always, say, "Oh, this is the new thing that you got to take and use if you want to be an elite athlete."
Well, the problem, Ben, is there's no regulation.
Yeah.
You know, we're used to, when we're talking about, drugs, there is at least a minimum. The pharmaceutical industry is by no means perfect, but there is at least a minimum threshold of evidence
Sure.
that has to be surpassed before a new drug can go on the market. There is no such threshold of evidence for new supplements. A supplement can be conceived, created, and can go on sale. It will only be pulled off the shelves by the FDA if there is proof that it causes active harm,
Right.
which is completely backwards, right? Normally,
Yeah.
you'd expect it has to be proven to be safe. Do some trials, prove that it's safe, then we'll let you sell it. But providing it contains no new novel ingredients that haven't been previously screened, you can design any supplement you want, sell it. It will only be taken off the shelves when there's evidence of harm, which is a really backwards system as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, I mean, it doesn't make much sense. That's right. Why would you let the general public be used as basically just sort of these testing dummies for
Guinea pigs, for sure.
for anything, and just like oh well, if a bunch of people die, I guess we'll take it off the shelf. But it's
Well, this is what happened with ephedrine. This is going back a few decades, but when ephedrine was first being used as a stimulant supplement, there were tens of thousands of cases of ephedrine poisoning, and people were having all sorts of problems, going to hospital. Small handful of people died. It was only then that they decided, well, maybe we shouldn't be letting people sell ephedrine indiscriminately.
right.
But we've obviously learned no lessons from that. Drugs are classified as something different. If something does contain an active drug, it is regulated a little bit better. But in terms of nutritional supplements, as long as something is targeted or is advertised and sold as I'm doing quotes with my fingers here if you're listening instead of watching, nutritional supplements, then there's little to no regulation.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to any of the sort of health and wellness stores in your town or anywhere else, you're going to find a lot of unregulated products that will say no, not approved by the FDA.
Yeah, sure. In
Um,
tiny little writing in
yeah,
italics on the side of the bottle.
that's
But
right.
if you look for it, it will say these statements have not been reviewed or approved by the FDA. And that's kind
Right.
of, that should be a red flag.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Unfortunately, probably a lot of people won't even think about it and will just, buy it because they say like, oh, Ultra Viper or something,
Mm,
muscle building,
yeah.
some ridiculous name. And then,
Beefcake
yeah,
2000 or something.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's just never ending. But yeah, and we sit here, we talk about like the U.S. industry, where there's lots of unregulated products, but this is a problem all over the world as well.
Absolutely.
I mean,
Yeah, for
it's
sure.
any country you live in, you're going to have tons of products that you're going to have access to that you can easily buy that are not going to have any science behind them and will not be, proven to be safe.
Yes, absolutely. It's just as I would say in some states in America, in the US, it's worse than in others. But
Yeah,
you see the same issues in all over Europe. It's by no means limited to the US. This idea of pseudoscience in health and fitness is a worldwide problem for sure.
yeah. Now, obviously, getting away from supplements and stuff a little bit. In general, when it comes to just the concept of trying to be healthy as a person, beyond whether you're interested in supplements or other things like that, what would you say are kind of the biggest health myths about someone who's successful at being physically fit, or maybe you're trying to lose weight or something like that? Obviously obesity rates around the world have gone up quite a bit, and they're going up more and more because of the pandemic and more people are being less active. But I guess a major reason for a lot of these supplements that exist are for weight loss, or for other aspects of trying to live a healthy lifestyle. What would you say are the sort of misconceptions that are, I guess, sort of the most common today when it
Hmm.
comes to stuff like that?
I would say the most common and probably the most harmful as well. I think for people who are really sort of poorly informed about how the body works and about health and fitness, I think one of the most harmful misunderstandings, if you like, is that exercise is the most important thing. In terms of, you mentioned the obesity rates are through the roof. But by 2030, it's predicted to be 1 in 2 Americans, 1 in 3 Europeans, not just overweight, but obese. So
Yeah.
that's half the population clinically obese by 2030. And I think there is this misunderstanding that as long as you're physically active and you're exercising, you can eat whatever you want.
Yeah.
But if we just do a little bit of math, if you go and exercise at a moderate intensity for an hour, let's say, which most people don't do on a daily basis, you might burn 500 calories. For example, off the top of my head, if you work really, really hard, you might burn 1,000 calories. But I'm saying at a moderate intensity, you'll burn, around 500 calories. And that's actually not a lot.
Right.
Just remaining conscious throughout the day, your normal resting metabolic rate, you'll burn in the region of about 2,000 calories. If you're lighter, it'll be lower. If you've got a bigger mass, it's going to be more than 2,000 calories. I think the average for a man is about 2,500 calories. So just if you were to sit still and just remain conscious, you'd burn about 2,000 calories. And an hour on the treadmill, you might burn 500 calories. So actually the most important thing for people who want to lose weight is to get their nutrition sorted. And this is, case in point, people can lose a lot of body fat just by eating better without exercising at all.
Yeah.
So obviously the most important part here is nutrition. Now, exercise is really important for cardiovascular health and whole body strength. So we've got to exercise regularly as well. But the misunderstanding is I can have this extra, bit of pizza, or I can have this extra can of cola, or I can have this extra cake because I went to the gym today and it's okay. And there's a well-recognized phenomenon called overcompensation,
Yep.
which is exactly that. People who are physically active tend to eat more junk food, and just because they think they can compensate. And even people who drink more diet soda, they tend to actually take in more calories
Okay.
because of this compensation effect. They think, oh, well, I've been good by drinking my diet cola. That means I can have an extra slice of cake later on, and it kind of it skews the scales, pun
Yeah,
intended. I guess the other big misconception is that there is something magic about going to the gym. I saw this, just anecdotal, but I saw this. It just made me laugh because there was somebody on the treadmill. This is pre-COVID when I was still going to the gym. Now I, do home gym or I go running on
sure.
the street. Um, but I was in the gym, and this girl was on the treadmill, and she was walking at about, must have been about 1 kilometer per hour.
Okay.
I mean, she
Yeah.
probably would have burned more calories walking from the changing room to the treadmill than she did actually on the whole duration
Right.
that she was on
Right.
she was going so slowly. But I think there's this sort of misconception that there's something novel or special about using the treadmill or sitting on the exercise bike, almost as if using equipment in the gym is going to help you burn calories. And there's a disconnect between this idea that actually to burn calories and get fit, you've got to get your heart rate up. You've got
Right.
to start sweating. You've got to become breathless. There's nothing magic about, standing on the treadmill and,
Right.
shuffling along at 1 kilometer per hour.
Yeah, you can't. That's right. You can't go to the gym for 15 minutes, then go home and eat 20 cookies. It's not gonna
Yeah, and
not gonna
or
help.
you could go to the gym for an hour and a half, but if you're not doing anything
Right.
there, if you're not being productive,
Yeah.
it's not going to help you. And you see a lot as well. You're going to regret getting me started on this
I
because
know.
I'm
This is
very
good.
passionate about.
This is what I want to hear, Nick. Come on. That's
Okay. Well, the other thing that gets me is when people say I hate running, and I hate, I can't run, but I just feel awful every time I go running, and my lungs are burning and my legs are sore. And I always ask, well, how often do you go running? And they say, I don't know, once every 2 weeks. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that's why it hurts so much. Because if you try and do anything, you try and learn a new language, you try and learn a musical instrument, and you do it once every 2 weeks, you're not going to improve. Exercise is just like anything else. You've got to be consistent, and
Yeah.
you've got to try and get your body used to it. And once you build up the mileage, and once you start doing it regularly, you'll find that actually running can be really enjoyable, and it doesn't have to hurt. But you've got to be willing to put in the time and allow the adaptations to take place.
Yeah. I mean, I think this phenomenon I see, all the time. I mean, it's just it's so common that you just see it. You could see it all the time. If you look for this in your daily life, you're going to see this all the time, no matter who you are. Where people are gonna be like, yeah, I'll go to the gym, and you're not really gonna, do a whole lot, and then you're gonna come home. Psychologically, you feel good because you went to the gym, and obviously, yeah, it takes a lot of discipline to get up and actually take your body to the gym to exercise. Um, but what you're actually doing there may not be all that helpful because, as you said already, you're not going to burn nearly as many calories as you think you're going to burn in the gym. Um, and it's going to be totally useless if your nutrition is totally out of whack, and you're consuming tons of calories and unhealthy food. Um, yeah, I just I feel like this happens all the time. I think it happens to pretty much everyone at some point in their life. We're like, I can eat this, I'll be fine. I'll go to the gym, or you're just like putting off the gym. That's another, I think, method that people have. Like, I'm gonna start exercising, next week. Next week I'm gonna get serious. Things are gonna change,
Yeah.
and
Well, that's in this month's. I write a column, as you kindly mentioned at the start, for Skeptical Inquirer, and then the upcoming column I talk about New Year's resolutions, and it's
yeah,
very appealing for people to want to start fresh. You say, okay, well, it's new year, new start, and it's very appealing because we can start the new year having put the errors of the past year behind us, and we can instill this sense of hope for the new
yes,
year. But this is where health and fitness marketing, to bring it back to this theme of pseudoscience in sport and medicine, this is where health and fitness marketing is so clever, because typically, if you want to achieve some kind of health or fitness outcome, it requires either an effort displacement, which means doing some exercise, putting in, the effort required to burn some calories over a period of time, or it's going to require a time displacement, which means, okay, a long-term training program or eating healthily over the
yep,
long term, right? And that's going to take time. But humans don't like time or effort displacement.
Nope.
We are inherently lazy as a species. We've evolved, as I said earlier, for economy, and we have this ingrained bias for the quick fix. We want quick results, we want quick outcomes, and we want them now. We want these quick, rapid results.
Yeah.
And so health and fitness marketing, if you take nothing else away from this discussion, take this away. Health and fitness marketing understands our biases better than we do in most cases. And they specifically design their marketing strategies to exploit our biases. So if you have a bias for a quick fix, which pretty much everyone does, then products and practices that are marketed on that quick fix are going to be wildly popular, because essentially what the product manufacturer is telling you is, take this diet pill, take this fat burning supplement, wear these running shoes, wear this Garmin, wear these compression tights, try this fad diet, and you'll achieve your health and fitness goals without having to put in the time and the effort that is normally required in order to achieve it. And we find it completely irresistible, because we are hardwired for that economy heuristic, and it's very, very difficult to resist. The only way to resist it is to become a critical thinker and to better understand the way that we make decisions in this context. And it's not just in health and fitness; it's in all facets of of commercial culture.
Yeah, it's a good point, because I mean, we've talked a lot about, whether people go to the gym or not. I mean, on the nutritional side, there's so many diets that are marketed to people, which are, basically, okay, you're going to do some ridiculous diet that is not going to be sustainable. and then you're going to, maybe you're going to have results initially, and then later it's just not going to work. So,
yeah. And most fad diets, are associated with yo-yo dieting.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that you try this fad diet for a period of time, and it's normally very low in calories, so you lose a lot of weight initially.
Yep.
But then the diet is not sustainable. It's not long-term sustainable. So inevitably you fall off the wagon. As soon as you try a diet and you conceive the idea of a wagon, you're going to fall off the wagon, right?
Yep.
The only true path to success is just understand that there is no wagon. As soon as you conceive the idea of a wagon, you're going to fall off it. And so people fall off the wagon, then they regain the weight. So then they try another fad diet, they lose some weight, they fall off the wagon, they regain the weight. And this yo-yo dieting that we see, also called weight cycling, has been associated with all sorts of, comorbidities, increased cardiovascular risk, particularly in women, associated with psychological distress, binge eating, life dissatisfaction, depression, and so forth. So these fad diets, superficially, they seem like they're offering the world. And, anytime something seems too good to be true, it usually is. Yeah. But actually, these fad diets are doing more harm than good, because people are spending their time and money on strategies that don't work in the long run, because the diet profits from the diet industry are at an all-time high. It's in the multi-billions of dollars. I can't remember the exact figure, but the diet industry is really as popular now as it's ever been, more popular now. But the rates of obesity are higher now than they've ever been. Right. So how do you consolidate? Excuse me. How do you consolidate those two different perspectives? Of those two different facts, the idea that the obesity is rampant and fad diets are rampant, there's some kind of disconnect there.
Right. Yeah. Something's not working clearly if obesity rates.
Something's not working. Exactly.
Yeah. Now, we've talked a lot about this now, but going into, I guess, more specifics, what would you describe to people that are, interested in trying to improve their daily routines to be healthier? How often do people need to try to exercise? And in terms of, food, what's the right balance between, having maybe some junk food, but also trying to make sure you get your nutrition? What's kind of a summary version of the best kind of routine, generally speaking, that a person can have to sort of get on this path of being a healthier person without sort of falling off a wagon, so to speak, as you mentioned?
Well, I think the most important rule is to, in terms of becoming physically active, we've got to try and retain some consistency. Consistency is key. But more important than that, I think you've got to enjoy the exercise that you do. You know, a good friend and colleague of mine, Paddy Ekakakis, has kind of made exercise and enjoyment or affect his life's work, and he's published extensively on this area. And I'm sure he would agree that being able to enjoy the exercise that you do is absolutely paramount for adherence, because it doesn't matter how good it is for you. If you hate doing it, you're not going to keep doing it. And so the key to exercise adherence is to enjoy it. So if you don't enjoy going to the gym, don't go to the gym. If you don't enjoy going running, then don't go running. Okay, the caveat is give it a chance. You know,
Right.
give it a chance. Don't just try it once and decide that you hate it. Try some interesting running routes. Go with a running club. Go with a buddy. Go to the gym with a friend. Do some exercise classes in groups, and that will increase your enjoyment. But you know, if you don't enjoy exercising alone, join a sports team. Join a netball club. Join a basketball team. Join a football club. You know, do something that is going to keep you coming back. That is the best form of exercise. In terms of the specific type of exercise, that's relatively less important. You know, in the exercise science community, people waste their time arguing about what's better for you, cardiovascular exercise or strength training, or what type of cardiovascular exercise. Is it high intensity interval training or endurance? And really, you know, we need to get a good balance of strength training and cardiovascular exercise, because they fundamentally do different things. Ultimately, you've got to enjoy it. That's the most important thing. I think in terms of the amount and intensity, you know, all governing bodies pretty much agree. You know, the World Health Organization, American Heart Association, they all pretty much agree on what the minimum amount of exercise should be, and it's exercising for between 30 and 60 minutes, 3 to 5 days of the week at a moderate to high intensity. And obviously, if you exercise at a higher intensity, then the amount that you do you can afford to have that a little bit less. If you're working a low intensity, then the volume needs to go up. But the vast majority of people don't meet the recommended physical activity guidelines. So the first thing we've got to do is try and get people from this sedentary baseline up to the very minimum, the minimum requirements, or the minimum recommended amount of physical activity, because most people are not meeting it. And I suppose to answer your question about diet, you know, I guess the key thing is to understand that the secret to healthy eating is that there is no secret. There is no magic diet. There is no magic pill. There is no special supplement. You could learn how to eat healthily, you know, in 20 minutes, you know, and certainly if I had a one-to-one with somebody, I could tell them how to eat healthily in 20 minutes. It's very simple. Most people know it already.
Right.
Don't eat too much junk food, right?
Yep.
Cut out junk food. Don't get too much takeaway food. Try not to drink much alcohol, if any. Alcohol, there's no amount that's, you know, beneficial, contrary to what's reported in the media, that a little bit of alcohol is good for your health. It's not true. So you can cut out refined sugars, cut out alcohol, and cut out confectionery and junk food. Nobody's sitting there eating their 15th slice of pizza thinking, this is good for me, right? It's got, you know, cheese and protein and stuff. Nobody's eating a loaf of bread a day thinking that it's good for them. Nobody's guzzling a liter of cola thinking, oh, well, I'm staying hydrated, that's okay. Most people fundamentally know what they should and shouldn't be eating. The real problem we have is getting people to care.
Right.
That's the difficult part. You can tell somebody how to exercise, you know, in 5 minutes. You could educate somebody on the basics of healthy eating in 10 minutes. Getting them, can I swear on this podcast, or would you prefer?
Yeah, you can do whatever you want. It's all right. Go for it.
Getting people to give a shit.
Yeah.
That's the real challenge.
Yeah.
And that is getting people to give a shit is a much bigger, complex problem, a more complex problem than I think anybody realizes. It's going to require, you know, behavioral psychology interventions. It's going to require an overlap between psychological interventions and physiological interventions. We need this multidisciplinary approach to get people to want to be healthy, to want to be active, to want to eat better.
Yeah.
Because at the moment they don't want to. You've only got to look at how many people still smoke.
Yeah.
And there's absolutely, the scientific evidence on cigarette smoking is absolutely unequivocal. We've known this since the 1960s. Even in the 40s and 50s, when they were, when doctors were recommending certain
Right.
brands of cigarettes,
Yeah.
even then we knew that it was no good for us. And there's nobody alive right now who thinks that who doesn't know that cigarette smoking is bad for them, but they still do it.
Yep.
So it's trying to crack the psychological barrier there, getting people to care enough in the first place. That's probably the biggest challenge.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, it's obviously, trying to get people to stop drinking alcohol or getting people to, not eat their favorite junk food or whatever. It's, a hopeless proposition to make. But, being able to cut back on that and not do it, all the time, that can make a big difference in your life. I mean, I remember when I graduated from college, I was very active, doing lots of sports and stuff like that. And then after college, I got into work, and my whole, your daily routine and schedule completely changes when you're actually working, every day, and you don't have as much free time and flexibility. And there's lots of stressful things when it comes to, dealing with all these new things when you get out of college. And I remember, I was struggling to really find a healthy balance of what foods I should eat. And I was just trying to find quick things. And then, I wasn't exercising nearly as much as I did before. And though, I didn't really put on much weight, or I didn't put on any weight, to be honest, just because I'm not a big eater. Like, I'll eat, but I won't overeat. I don't feel good if I do that. I have a pretty good sort of self-stopping mechanism, I suppose, of some sort. But I remember going to the doctor and getting like a high blood pressure reading for the first time in my life. I'm like, whoa, like what just happened? And that went away after a year of just, getting back into a routine. But, it's something that can impact anyone. If you just stop taking care of yourself, or you just don't care, it's not only gonna happen to you, but it's gonna get worse and worse over time. And I suppose, one of the, you would hope that when you go to a doctor and you get a reading, that people, take it seriously. They're like, hey, like, this is not good. This is not going to be good in the long term. And it can seriously shorten your lifespan if you don't make a change. And perhaps not everyone really is able to process that, or they don't want to try to process it. But, there's so much that we can do to help ourselves. And it's just kind of finding that right balance and the right attitude to go about it. You shouldn't torture yourself. But I guess that's just a struggle for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you that there's absolutely no need to cut out junk food completely. And that's unrealistic, because that's something that people tend to do at the start of the new year when they start their New Year's resolution.
Yeah.
Or they follow a new diet. Again, I'm doing the quotes. They follow a new diet and they stop eating any kind of junk food at all.
Right.
And say, right, I'm following this diet. And as you say, how long is that sustainable for? So what, you're never going to eat any more junk food ever again? That's not realistic.
Yeah.
And then you fall off the wagon, and instead of, integrating a bit of junk food as a kind of a reward mechanism, once a week, to reward yourself from eating, for eating healthily the whole rest of the time, and then, continuing with your healthy eating program, people fall off the wagon and then they binge eat for 3 days, and they take in more calories than they lost to begin with. And so it's not realistic to cut this stuff out of your diet completely. So whatever your baseline is at the moment, just do something. If you're eating candy bar every day, just cut it out, 2 or 3 days of the week. Just do something.
Yeah.
If you're currently not doing any exercise, you don't have to go and run a marathon next year. Just go for a long walk once or twice a week to begin with, and build it up. Just do something. And as long as you're doing something, then you're in a better place than you were yesterday. because
Right.
as you said, it sneaks up on you, especially when you're young, when you're in your 20s. You can afford to uh, pretty much eat whatever you like because
Yep.
you're physically active. But as your body changes, as you get older, you leave school, so you're not physically active at school. You probably get a sedentary job, because most people do have sedentary jobs. Being sedentary is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So even if you're fit and active, in the whole rest of your life, if you're sitting down for 8 hours a day at work, that is an independent risk factor. So it's just about thinking about where you are now and just doing something to correct it. And that something can't be taking a fat burning supplement or trying a crash weight loss diet, or trying cryotherapy, which
Yeah.
I also wrote about recently, because cryotherapy has been shown to help promote recovery in some low level studies. It's
Yeah.
about doing something authentic that is going to require a bit of discipline. It is going to require a bit of work and a bit of time, but it's those kinds of interventions that ultimately give you the greatest outcomes.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's yeah, trying to be patient and just take it day by day. Because I think, especially when people do try these sort of shortcuts, I mean, just psychologically, it's so depressing. To think like, okay, I'm just gonna do this and it's magically go away, and then it all falls apart, and then you're probably less interested in trying to, make a difference than you are before. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest moral failings of society today is letting companies promote these products that make people give up, or allow people to promote these ideas like, oh, if you're obese, there's just nothing you can do about it, that's just, it's unlucky or whatever, nothing you can do. Or, oh, you take this supplement and you know everything will be fine. I think in many ways it can even have sort of this path where someone goes from taking supplements, then gives up and feels it's hopeless. It's just, I can't control it, it just happened to me, it's unlucky. That killing hope, I think, is one of the most dangerous things and one of the biggest moral failings of the modern world today, when it comes to health, because it's just, you're ruining people's lives when you do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, it's a wonderful way of driving the economy, because we contribute to the economy twice over. So if you think about how the mechanisms of obesity is that we're over consuming, or
Yeah.
certainly over consuming the wrong foods. So we're paying for this. So we're consuming too many calories. Okay, there are some instances where obesity can be caused by hormone imbalances and other genetic conditions.
Sure.
Those are very rare, though. In most cases, it's because people are, have a calorie surplus. And so we're contributing to the economy in that respect. And then to try and remedy the situation, we are trying these fad diets and paying for supplements. So we're contributing to the economy a second time. And it's really important that people understand that trying ineffective products and practices does more harm than good, because it's demotivating, it's soul destroying when you try something and you really invest in it, time and money and other resources, and it doesn't work. And that's absolutely soul destroying. And sooner or later, people can only take a certain number of setbacks before they give up entirely.
Yeah.
And how often do we see that? Somebody who just jumps from one diet to the next diet, hoping that this is going to be the one to help them keep the weight off. And the one thing that they've never really tried is just eating healthily in a sustainable way on a day-to-day basis, and
Yeah.
steering clear of fad diets altogether.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, definitely. And I guess some other things we didn't talk about that also impacts this is the belief that you have to go to the gym. You can work out, from home. You can just go out of your house or apartment or whatever, and do exercising by just walking along areas around, or that you have to buy like something like organic food. The big anti-GMO movement, I think, is
Mhm.
another big contributor of promoting pseudoscience, and you can see how it could uh, make people who are trying to be healthy feel like, oh geez, I have to spend tons of money to do this isn't worth it.
Well, let's dwell on that just for a few minutes, because it's a wonderful example of marketing rhetoric and how marketing can be used
Yeah.
to exploit people's fears and people's biases. So the premise here that people need to understand is that GMOs, so genetically modified organisms, particularly GMO food, is it's somewhat of a divisive issue. There's the scientific community are not divided. There is nothing wrong with GMO foods.
Right.
They're absolutely safe. GMOs have been widely studied by a number of different scientific organizations, and they all unanimously agree, governmental and non-governmental, all around the world, that GMO food is absolutely safe. There is nothing wrong with GMO food. Food has been genetically modified since the dawn of time, since the dawn of agriculture. We're not just talking about things that might be genetically modified in a lab, but any time that you select for a given genetic strain of a food, it's being genetically modified.
Right.
That's why we have tomatoes that are red, and you know different types of potatoes, different types of cabbages, is because at some point a group of farmers have genetically selected for a given strain of the vegetable or the fruit. So this idea of GMO is completely erroneous, because everything is GMO, whether it's
Right.
made
Yeah.
in a lab or not, and it's absolutely safe. But by convincing people that GMOs are bad and unethical, and by creating terms like frankenfoods, it creates fear and it creates misunderstanding on which you can build an entire organic food industry.
Yep.
So people who are scared about buying GMO, people who are scared about ingesting pesticides, people who are worried about the ethical implications, have an industry into which they can pour their money. And of course, organic food is more expensive than non-organic food. Now, if you want to buy organic, that's fine. I know people that buy organic, and you can argue that the food tastes a bit better. Maybe it does, I don't know.
Yeah.
Certainly organic food in some cases is bigger, sometimes it's smaller as well. The nutrient content, it's been studied. There's very little nutrient content when relative to the size of the fruit or the vegetable or the produce. There's hardly any difference in nutrient content. And we don't really need to be concerned about pesticides, especially if you wash your fruit before you eat it, which I do. But organic food is more expensive, and people will pay for non-GMO produce because they are under this kind of misapprehension that GMOs are somehow bad for them. So
Yeah.
again, it's wonderful marketing rhetoric, but it's creating an industry by exploiting this fear and this misunderstanding.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that seems to have taken off quite a bit over the last 10 years, especially. I remember when the movement was kind of first starting and thinking, like, okay, this is pretty strange. And now it's just like there's organic stores in every town, city, um, and in some places, around the world. I mean, people are so obsessed with organic. I think in, like, for example, in Russia, like, a lot of people are very concerned about the idea of genetically modified organisms, and there's been laws put in place to sort of limit um, the ability to have GMOs. And this is, I think, an issue in a lot of different countries around the world as well. It's just, and ironically, it's just kind of a marketing ploy. You put all natural. Yeah, it's funny, all the new sort of categorizations they come up with, where it's like all natural, gluten free, anything they can come up with.
Yeah.
Um,
But it's sad and frustrating, because we're in a very privileged position here in the West, particularly if you can afford to go and buy organic, you're immensely privileged,
yeah,
because a large percentage of the world is starving. There isn't enough food to go around. Well, no, there is enough food to go around. It's not getting round.
right, right,
And genetically modified foods are one of the only ways that we can develop drought resistant and pest resistant foods, enough of it, in order to feed starving populations. And so actually, if we don't to a certain extent rely on GMO produce, then whole populations, whole civilizations of people are not going to get enough food. Certainly, GMO produce is going
yeah.
to play a really important role in correcting that imbalance. And so by being privileged enough to say, well, GMOs are bad, we should do away with them, and we should all buy organic, I just think it's a very nearsighted view. I don't think it's really considering the broad implications of that kind of suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, it's the ability for people to continue to uh, alter things to become more efficient as they can do with genetically modified organisms, and require less land and less it's not as expensive because it's easier to produce, but yeah, it's this, the rejection of science continues to be self-defeating. It's not going to help anything in the long run, and
It's a rejection of science on ideological
yeah,
basis, on an ideological basis.
right.
And that's what we've got to do more work to try and cut through.
Yeah. Now, I guess one more thing before we get close to wrapping this up. What are there other factors at play when it comes to people who are trying to lose weight? For example, does your height matter, or what about age? What tips would you have for people in different categories that are trying to battle the thing that all of us are battling, which is trying to maintain a healthy lifestyle?
Well, age certainly does play a role. It becomes more difficult as you get older, but the more and more studies now are being published looking at age-related muscle loss and muscle wasting, sarcopenia, for example, and they all agree that even older people, 60s, 70s, and even older than that, are benefiting from regular exercise, whether it's regular cardiovascular exercise or strength training. And actually, if you exercise earlier in life at a younger age, then that will see you in a better position in later life. So being physically active throughout the lifespan is important, and again, particularly in younger individuals. So again, the studies show that if you are physically active when you are young, it does sort of bleed through into adulthood as well. Whereas if you're not physically active and you're overweight and unhealthy when you're young, then it's more likely to affect you in adolescence and in young adulthood as well. So we've got to try and promote physical activity throughout the lifespan. Genetics does play a huge factor. Some people are just naturally heavy and some people are naturally skinny. We all know somebody who can eat like a horse and eat junk food and drink and do whatever they like and they never put on any weight.
Right.
We all know somebody like that, and that's because everybody is different. So I think a key part of the puzzle is to understand how your body works. It's a little bit trial and error, but you've got to try and come up with a program and work with a professional if you need to, but come up with a program that is bespoke for you and how your body responds, and find an exercise that or a group of exercises that you respond very well to. Find the foods that you can and can't eat, particularly with differences in gut tolerance and things like this. Again, just from a personal perspective, I've been forced to radically rethink my diet over the years, just because I've had stomach issues. I became lactose intolerant about 6 years ago, just completely out of the blue, even though I'd never had any lactose intolerance when I was younger. So you just have to kind of constantly rethink and revise what you're eating and your physical activities. You get older and you pick up injuries and things. You've constantly got to be in this sort of feedback loop of, essentially, it's critical thinking. It's evaluating and reapplying the lessons that you've learned in order to optimize what you're doing. And I suppose the other thing to mention, and this is, again, it's a sensitive topic, but this kind of comes into I suppose, the genetics argument as well. Somebody was asking me recently, is it better to be this notion of being fat and fit? Mm-hmm. Is it better to be fat and fit, or skinny and unfit, or lean and unfit?
Right,
what's better? Is it, because a lot of people who are overweight are very physically active and are very physically fit, mm-hmm. and a lot of people who are skinny or lean and sort of normal weight don't do any exercise and they're not fit at all. And he asked me which one is better, and I said, why do they have to be dichotomous? It's a false dichotomy, because actually you can be normal weight and fit.
Yes, right.
You don't have to pick between the two.
Right.
It's better to be normal weight and fit than fat and fit, or normal weight and unfit. So really, that's what we mean when we say try and be physically active, focus on eating healthily, and try and get in that place where you can where you enjoy your exercise and it's something that you can adhere to, is the most important thing.
Yeah. So if I understand you correctly, then when it comes to aging over time, I mean, I suppose you can't control the fact that you're getting older. You can just mitigate the effects of aging by having a
Correct.
healthy lifestyle. But if you're like really fit and you have like abs or something like that when you're in your 20s or 30s, probably when you're in your 70s, you're probably not gonna be able to maintain that body no matter what you do. You're just gonna have to just do the best you can because that's just life.
Everything plummets as you get older. That's, as you said, that's a fact of life. So your maximal aerobic capacity, what we call VO2 max, will naturally decline with age. You'll lose muscle mass with age. Your lung function will decline slowly with age as well. That's just what it means to. This is one of the characteristics of getting old, but it can be mitigated by being physically active, and there is so much research now showing that it's never too late to start. So even if you are older, it's never too late to start exercising, and all of the research that's been done in clinical populations. We do a lot of work here at my lab in COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And these people have obstructive lung disease. They're normally lifelong smokers. Sometimes they quit smoking and then get COPD many years later. And most of them are in older age as well. And what's fascinating is that even though this is a respiratory disorder, most COPD patients are not really sick and they don't die from COPD.
Yeah.
They get really sick and they die from cardiovascular disease. The reason being is because the lung disease stops them from exercising. It stops them from being physically active. So they stop exercising because one of the characteristics of COPD is breathlessness. It's very uncomfortable to do any physical activity.
Right.
So they don't do any physical activity. Their fitness declines. They get sort of muscle deconditioning, which exacerbates the whole situation. And it's this downward spiral. So they get cardiovascular disease, and that's when they get really sick.
Yeah.
So, and that lesson can be applied across the board in clinical and non-clinical populations. Physical activity is really important in maintaining your cardiovascular health, your cardiovascular fitness. And it's something that you need to consider throughout all stages of life, but it's never too late to start exercising.
Yeah. Now, when you get older, if you were to exercise more than you did when you're younger, could you mitigate the effects of aging? Could you help maintain perhaps that body that you want to maintain? Or is it just kind of like, there's a limit to how much exercise you could do, where it's just not going to have any greater effects over time?
There's a dose response. There's sort of more exercise is better up to a point.
Yeah.
And then if you overtip the scales, that's when you get injured and you start picking up, infections, and you get sick because your immune system will suffer. But what's interesting is that a lot of the research that I'm involved in is in ultra endurance exercise, obviously my personal interest as well as a professional one. And actually what we see is that the best ultra endurance performances tend to occur in sort of older life. So up to the age of about 50 years old. Most marathon runners will be most successful in their early 30s, but if you're running short distance ultra marathons, you'll be successful between the age of 35 to 40. If you're running the really long stuff, or if you're involved in any really long distance ultra endurance exercise, you can be really good at it up to about the age of 50. And some of the world records are now broken by men and women in their mid to late 40s.
Jeez,
so
wow.
And I think that's because being older lends itself, from a physiological perspective, being older confers some kind of advantage in ultra endurance sport, not just from experience, but from a training perspective and from an endurance perspective, because you can maintain endurance better than you can retain things like strength and maximal fitness. Your maximal fitness will decline much earlier than your general kind of overall whole body endurance, which is why people tend to be able to perform as ultra endurance athletes a little bit later on in life. But yeah, to try and answer your question, we don't really know. There isn't a set upper limit, but to a certain point, more is better. You've just got to be very sensible. If you've never exercised before, I don't recommend starting training 6 days a week. It's something that you need to build up to it
Yeah.
and listen to your body. And if you start feeling like you're overdoing it, then you need to, and especially if you are, in the older population, or if you've never exercised before, it's always a good idea to have a discussion with your physician, with your primary care provider before starting a new
Yeah.
exercise program. It's very rare to have some kind of catastrophic event
Mhm.
on starting a new exercise program, but in very rare cases it does happen. So if you've never exercised, or if you are older, it's always a good idea to speak with your physician
Yeah.
first.
Sure. Definitely better safe than sorry.
Exactly, yeah, that's
Uh,
the disclaimer.
yeah. Now, one last thing, another factor in terms of your height, does height make a difference at all when it comes to your ability to lose weight? You know, for example, if you're really short, is your body's ability to burn calories or keep calories or something like that, does that have any factor at all? Because I hear a lot of people that say like, oh, I'm short, I can't, it's harder for me than someone who's really tall, and I put on more weight, or at least it's more noticeable weight. What exactly is the science on that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think there is so much into individual variance that I think it's an impossible question to answer, because some people who are very short will find it incredibly difficult to put on weight, and some people who are very tall will find it also incredibly difficult to put on weight.
You're right.
So I think there is so much variance within our species that it's almost impossible to say. Certainly, there is this sort of myth that if you're very tall and you carry a lot of weight, then
Right.
there's this idea that you carry it better. I don't know if there's any science to that. It may just be a myth. It feels like it should be intuitive, but I can't answer that from a scientific perspective. I
Yeah.
suppose on a tangent, it is this idea that taller people can there are so many different factors that can contribute to being a good athlete and sports performance and being fit and healthy. And certainly there is no kind of body type restriction to that. But it's always important to take note of your body type. So, for example, you'll notice that certain athletes have certain body types. So Olympic rowers tend to be very, very tall, and they tend to carry, a little bit of extra weight. They're usually quite muscular. Endurance runners tend to be very, very skinny. They don't carry very much muscle mass or body fat.
Yeah.
People who are weightlifters tend to be more compact, tend to be stockier, and they tend to have kind of shorter limbs, because that means they don't have to move the weight as much. So I think before engaging in any kind of sporting activity, it's always a good idea to think about, the most important thing is whether you're going to enjoy it. But secondly, if you're thinking about performance, I suppose it's, what sport are you ideally going to be suited to based on your body type. I always found it very interesting that tall people tend to have bigger lung capacities, and that sort of, in theory, would predispose somebody to being a better endurance athlete, because if you have bigger lungs, you have bigger lung capacity, you can move more air in and out of the lungs. But there are so many other factors that
Right.
that are at play here, that it's impossible to predict whether somebody's going to be a good athlete based on one single factor. But the only thing that I'm aware that height will really affect is lung capacity, because if you're taller and you have a bigger frame, you're going to have bigger lungs. So
Right.
you've got that going for you for sure.
So regardless, then, if you're sort of tall or short, your ability to like burn calories and lose weight, there's nothing that pinpoints that should make a difference. I mean, there's obviously, I guess, genetically different body types can occur, but generally speaking, there really isn't anything that suggests that that should be a major factor to be concerned about.
No, certainly not in terms of height. Obviously, mass is different, because somebody with a larger body mass is going to burn more calories.
Yeah.
So they're going to need more calories. And somebody with a smaller mass, because they don't have to supply as many calories to the smaller mass, and the metabolic rate is probably going to be different as well. So
Yeah.
in general, somebody who's smaller with a smaller mass is going to burn fewer calories than somebody who's bigger. But I think that is independent of height, because you can have somebody who's tall that is also very lean. You could have somebody who's short who's quite stocky. They might have a similar overall body mass. But in terms of height on its own, I think that's just one factor of very many that we can throw into the equation.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So, like, yeah, your body type then can play a factor in that. Just genetics, that's just what you're born with or whatever. But yeah, just height by itself is not the thing that really makes a difference.
Sure.
So I want to ask, what are you currently working on? What research are you doing right now?
Yeah, so I'm based in the Institute of Respiratory Medicine and Exercise Physiology. That's the Lundquist Institute at Harvard UCLA. I have several lines of research, primarily the stuff that I do in patients in COPD. We're looking at exercise tolerance in people with obstructive lung disease. And we're just starting a new project looking at mitochondrial function. Mitochondria are kind of the powerhouses of the cell and really have a crucial role in oxidative function, in how we utilize oxygen. So we're looking to see how mitochondria might be affected by COPD. The ultra endurance research that I'm doing, we are about to publish a fascinating study looking at sex-specific responses to ultra endurance exercise. That's a project that I have been doing in collaboration with the Mayo Clinic. And I'm working with, I've mentioned him already, he's going to get another mention, with my good friend and colleague, Paddy Ekakakis, on a series of papers specifically on pseudoscience, critical thinking, and good research practice in the exercise sciences. So we're sort of finalizing those papers at the moment, and I suppose it'll be good to mention my my column at the Skeptical Inquirer. That's a monthly column on it's called The Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science, and it's basically reframing the health and fitness industry through the critical lens of scientific skepticism. So that's, in my humble opinion, it's always a good read.
Awesome. Well, then plenty of things for people to check out and learn more about how to navigate this world of fitness and health. And how can people follow you? What's the best way to stay up to date on your work and research?
Yeah, thank you. So you can follow me on Twitter at NBTiller. And I tweet about health and fitness and critical thinking, pseudoscience, and all of the good stuff. And you can find out more about my book and the projects that I'm working on at my website, and that's nbtiller.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on and doing this. And thank you for all the work that you do. It's, I think, a really important position that you have in this world where it's really tough for a lot of people to navigate, how to live better lives and healthy ones. So thanks again.
Well, thank you for the time. It was a lot of fun. Thanks, Ben.